All right, so in this segment, I'm going to talk about how we transport gases through our body. But first, you need to know what air is, because of course that's what we do pulmonary ventilation with. That's what we take into our body and release from our body. And air is mostly nitrogen. It's about 78% nitrogen. These numbers vary a little bit depending on where you're at. And it'll be about 21 to 22% oxygen. And then a slew of other gases, but only in small amounts. So a little bit of argon, a little bit of neon, a little bit of CO2, but all of those gases make up only a small fraction of the total percentage in your air. So what you mostly breathe in is nitrogen, and you don't really absorb much of it. You've got equal amounts of nitrogen in your blood compared to the air, and you need a gradient for stuff to move in any particular direction. So we can ignore the nitrogen. It's not really utilized by the body. We do need nitrogen in our body. We need to take it into our body, but our means of introducing nitrogen to the body that we can use anyways is through food. So the nitrogen that passively moves into and out of our blood is not really something that's biologically important to talk about. The only exception to that is if you're a deep sea diver. So you can look up the so-called bends if you want to see about how nitrogen levels can play a role in somebody who's doing deep sea diving. But for the purposes of our class, we won't really talk about the nitrogen. So we'll focus more on, of course, the oxygen and the CO2. The CO2 leaves the body, of course, through the lungs, and oxygen enters the body through the lungs. And we'll discuss how we move those gases through the body. Well, I'll use a term called partial pressure a lot. I want you to think of partial pressure as percentage or concentration. So if I'm talking about, say, the partial pressure of oxygen, think of that as just the percentage or amount of oxygen in whatever given area we're talking about. And the partial pressure determines the rate at which gases will diffuse. So if you have a greater partial pressure in one place and lesser in another place, then those gases will move from high partial pressure to low. So think of it as just concentration. The air in your alveoli is not exactly the same as the air around your body. It's going to be warmer, it's going to be moister, and you're going to have gas exchange taking place in the blood, and it'll mix with the residual air hanging out in your lungs. So alveolar air is not identical to atmospheric air around your body. All right, so just a little bit about timing. It takes 3/4 of a second for a red blood cell to pass through a capillary surrounding an alveolus. We call them alveolar or pulmonary capillaries. And within that 3/4 of a second, equilibrium will be achieved in just a fraction of that, just 1/4 of a second. By equilibrium, I mean any CO2 that was going to leave the blood will have, and any oxygen that would enter the blood will have already done it. So equilibrium is achieved very rapidly as those gases diffuse from high concentration or high partial pressure to low. When you exercise, those rates are faster. So remember, it takes 3/4 of a second for blood to pass through an alveolar capillary when you're at rest, but when you're exercising, it's only 1/3 of a second for blood to pass through an alveolar capillary. Very quick, which makes sense because you want those gases to exchange faster when you're exercising. All right, so what factors can affect how rapidly those gases are exchanged? One concept is Henry's law, and this is simply the idea that the amount of gas in an area is going to determine how much of it will be dissolved into water. Also, the solubility of the gas itself plays a role. So Henry's law includes both concentration gradients of gases and gas solubility. So the 2 bullet points under Henry's law are the 2 parts or aspects of Henry's law. So let me put Henry's law into an everyday example. Think about a soda. So you've got a bottle of, say, Coke, and you haven't opened it yet. So picture a plastic bottle of Coke that you haven't opened yet. The little gap of air just above your Coke, the fluid, is almost 100% CO2. So a lot of CO2. And that CO2, a lot of it, will go from the air above the fluid down into the fluid. So it'll go from high concentration to low and go down into the fluid. Now, that's due to the high concentration of CO2 in the air above the fluid. But imagine opening that soda. You hear that hiss as all the CO2 escapes. So now there's almost no CO2 in the space above the Coke. So now the CO2 that's inside the Coke will leave the Coke as it goes from high concentration to low. Another factor, though, is not just the concentration gradients of the gases, like in the example I just gave with the Coke that you open, but also the solubility level of the gas. Some gases dissolve into water a lot more readily than others. In your body, the two gases we're concerned with are CO2 and O2. CO2 is 20 times more willing to dissolve into water than oxygen. Another factor that affects how the gases exchange in your lungs is the thickness of the wall of your alveoli, and we call that membrane thickness. If they're a proper thickness, they should only be half a micrometer thick. To give you perspective, the diameter of a human hair is 10 micrometers. So picture half a micrometer. We're talking very, very, very thin. And a nice thin membrane ensures efficient gas exchange. Now, if you're a smoker, residues from the smoking will build up on the walls of your alveoli, effectively making your membrane thicker, and that makes gas exchange slower and less efficient. Another factor that can affect gas exchange is the amount of surface area. In normal, healthy human lungs, you've got 70 square meters of surface area. And that means when you take in a normal amount of blood into your alveolar capillaries, about 100 mils, to give you perspective, 100 mils is about 3 ounces, so that's like a fourth of a can of Coke, right? So 3 ounces of blood will be spread over 70 square meters. That's a pretty astonishing amount of surface area. More surface area means more efficiency at gas exchange. Finally, another aspect that's important is you need to couple or combine ventilation with perfusion. In other words, you need to make sure that the areas that get good ventilation, the parts of your lungs that are getting an adequate volume of air, also have an adequate blood supply. For example, if you have lack of blood supply to a particular area of a lung, you could be ventilating that part of the lung all you want, and not much gas exchange is going to take place if that part of the lung is not getting a good perfusion of blood. All right, so let's talk about how we transport oxygen in the body. If you look at the amount of oxygen in your arterial blood, so your arteries primarily, not always, but primarily carry oxygenated blood. The exception would be your pulmonary arteries. But if you look at any other arterial blood aside from your pulmonary arteries, they should have about 20 milliliters of oxygen per deciliter. It's easier to think in terms of percentages, though. You should have about 98% of that oxygen will be bound to a protein called hemoglobin, and only about 1.5% of the oxygen will be dissolved in plasma. Remember, oxygen has poor solubility in water, so instead of just dissolving it in our blood plasma, we carry it with a protein called hemoglobin. Each hemoglobin protein can carry 4 different oxygen molecules. So we would describe a hemoglobin molecule as fully loaded when it has all 4 of its spots filled with oxygen. Whenever hemoglobin is bound to oxygen, we call it oxyhemoglobin. We abbreviate oxyhemoglobin HbO2. Whenever hemoglobin is empty or not bound to oxygen, we call it deoxyhemoglobin, which is abbreviated HHB. So do what it takes to memorize those abbreviations, because a lot of times on diagrams and stuff, instead of the full name, you'll see the abbreviations. Okay, we can look at what's called an oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve, and this is just the relationship between how saturated or full your hemoglobin molecules are compared to the amount of oxygen in the air that you're breathing. And the relationship is not a linear one. Linear would be like the red line that I just drew. That's a linear relationship. But that's not what you see. Instead, focus on the black line. Notice that the initial part of the curve is much steeper than a linear relationship. So why is the first part of the curve so steep? Well, for molecular reasons involving the shape of hemoglobin, the second hemoglobin gets one oxygen, it will change shape to make it more able to gather 2, 3, and 4 oxygen molecules. So you get a sudden increase in the size or slope of the dissociation curve because hemoglobin gets better at holding oxygen the second it's loaded with one oxygen molecule. So you get a fairly steep curve. That's called positive feedback, when you have one thing happen and that causes the same thing to happen even more so. Now, your metabolic needs can change how rapidly you load or unload oxygen from hemoglobin molecules. All right, so if you look at the amount of oxygen in your alveolar blood, your hemoglobin molecules are literally 100% loaded with oxygen, meaning if you look at all of the hemoglobins in the blood of your lungs, 100% of those hemoglobins will be fully loaded at 4 oxygen molecules apiece. Then that nice oxygenated blood will move out to your tissues. And as that blood moves out to your tissues, oxygen will leave hemoglobin and be delivered to your tissues. But even out at your tissues, only 25% of the oxygen will leave, meaning your hemoglobins are still partially filled with oxygen. So you have, in other words, a big storage of oxygen in your blood that's frequently never fully depleted. So how can metabolic needs adjust your rate of unloading of oxygen? Well, if a tissue is active, like if you're exercising, you'll have less oxygen in your tissues because your tissues are using up that oxygen to make energy as you exercise, and therefore hemoglobin will respond by releasing more oxygen. So instead of just releasing 25%, you might release a higher percentage. Another thing that can play a role is temperature. Active tissues, when you're exercising, get warmer because you're generating a lot of heat as muscles move. And increased temperature causes hemoglobin to release more oxygen, which is good because we want our active tissues to get more oxygen so they can make enough energy to remain active. And finally, you have something called the Bohr effect. Active tissues not only will be consuming more oxygen, but they will be releasing more CO2 as they make energy. And that CO2 is going to affect blood pH by lowering the pH, and hemoglobin responds to a low pH by, as you might have guessed, releasing more oxygen. So all of those factors combine to ensure that active tissues get more oxygen as they need it. Here are some diagrams to that effect, or graphs I should say to that effect. So normal body temperature is about 38 degrees Celsius, of course 98.6 Fahrenheit. And if you compare the normal body temperature curve, that's the black one, compare it to the red curve, 43 degrees Celsius, notice that as the body temperature increases, the amount of hemoglobin that's bound to oxygen decreases. In other words, as body temperature increases, hemoglobin will let go of more oxygen. Look in the lower right corner and look at the pH diagram. Look at the black line. That would be normal, regular old blood pH, 7.4. Imagine if you were to get a lot of CO2 in the blood due to really, really active tissues, then pH will go down. So look at the one that says pH of 7.2, and you'll notice that curve is lower because hemoglobin will have released more oxygen in response to that decreased pH. Okay, so what determines how we carry CO2 and how much we carry? we have something called the Haldane effect. These are just named after the scientists that originally described the effects. So the Haldane effect is if you've got low levels of HbO2 activity. Remember, HbO2 stands for oxyhemoglobin. In other words, if a lot of your hemoglobins aren't attached to oxygen or are not fully loaded, they will then be able to transport more CO2. Now, if you've got oxyhemoglobin, but let's say it's not completely full, let's say it's got 1 or 2 oxygen molecules rather than being full at 4, it can bind to CO2, but it doesn't do it very well. Now, let's say you've got a totally empty hemoglobin. We call that deoxyhemoglobin, or HHB. That will pretty readily bind to CO2. So only completely empty hemoglobins are going to be really decent at binding CO2. The main way, though, that you carry CO2 is not in the form of carbaminohemoglobin, which is, by the way, what we call it when hemoglobin binds to carbon dioxide. That's not the primary way we carry CO2. The primary way we carry CO2 is in a molecule called bicarbonate. And if you look at the chemical reaction kind of lower down on the screen where it says CO2 plus H2O, etc., HCO3 is bicarbonate. So instead of dissolving CO2 directly in our plasma, typically what happens is we convert it to a molecule called bicarbonate, HCO3, and that's the primary way that we carry CO2 in our body.